Hello children, welcome to Story Time with Pip School System. Today we will be reading a story from the Oxford Reading Treasure called The Two Frogs and Other Stories. It's written by Nicholas Horsberg. The story that we will be reading is called The Pot That Died. Mrs. Sheikh was cooking the evening meal. She looked out of her kitchen window. She could see Mrs. Risby in the garden next door. Mrs. Risby was collecting some jasmine flowers. But the flowers were not growing in Mrs. Risby's garden. They were growing on Mrs. Sheikh's jasmine plants. "Oh, well," sighed Mrs. Sheikh. "There's nothing wrong with that. Let Mrs. Risby pluck the flowers on my plants. After all, neighbors should share things with each other. And I do want to borrow a large pot from her." Mrs. Sheikh opened the back door and went out into her garden. She looked over the back fence. Mrs. Risby was still busy plucking flowers. "Hello, Rehanna," cooed Mrs. Sheikh. Mrs. Risby leapt in the air and spilled the flowers she was holding in her hand. "Oh, hello, Parveen," squeaked Mrs. Risby. "I didn't see you there. I was just tidying up the garden a little." "Yes, so I can see," said Mrs. Sheikh. "There are lots of jasmine flowers on your lawn. I hope our plant is not making a big mess in your garden." No, said Mrs. Risby. "Not at all. I like the smell of these flowers. It's a beautiful plant." "Yes," said Mrs. Sheikh. "Please take as many flowers as you like, when you like." "Thank you, that is so kind," said Mrs. Risby, and she bent down to pick up the flowers she had dropped. Mrs. Sheikh watched her closely. Then she came up to the fence. "I wonder, Rehanna," said Mrs. Sheikh, "do you have a large pot I could borrow? I'm making a fish curry tonight. It's for my husband and his friends. If you have a big pot, I'd like to borrow it." "Yes, certainly," said Mrs. Risby, and she hurried inside with her flowers. A few minutes later, Mrs. Risby came out again. She was now carrying a large pot in her hands. "Here you are, Parveen," said Mrs. Risby, handing the pot over the fence to Mrs. Sheikh. "It's a nice big copper pot. It would be good for making your fish curry." "That's kind of you," said Mrs. Sheikh. "I'll return it soon." "Take your time," said Mrs. Risby sweetly. Mrs. Sheikh went back into her kitchen. A few days later, Mrs. Sheikh saw Mrs. Risby in the garden again. She picked up the pot and went outside. "Hello, Rehanna," said Mrs. Sheikh. "Here's your pot. It's nice and clean. The fish curry I made was very tasty. It must have been because of the pot. Thank you for letting me borrow it." "There is no need to thank me," said Mrs. Risby. She took the pot from Mrs. Sheikh. It was nice and clean, and it glistened in the sunlight. "But what's this?" asked Mrs. Risby, looking inside the pot. "There's a small pot inside my pot." "Oh," said Mrs. Sheikh. "While it was in my kitchen, it gave birth to a little one." Mrs. Risby looked puzzled. "Yes," continued Mrs. Sheikh, "it really did have a baby pot. You own the mother pot, so the baby pot is yours. You keep it. We cannot separate the mother from the baby, can we? The baby needs the mother. Mrs. Risby looked very puzzled. Indeed, she stared at the pot and the pot's baby. She could not believe what she was hearing. She thought Mrs. Shake had gone quite mad, but she did not say anything about that. I have a nice new pot, thought Mrs. Risby. If that mad woman wants to give me this baby pot, let her. It has cost me nothing. She smiled sweetly and went into her house with the two pots. A few weeks went by. Once again, Mrs. Sheikh wanted to borrow Mrs. Rizvi's large pot. So, when she saw Mrs. Rizvi in her garden, she went outside. "Hello, Rihanna," sang Mrs. Sheikh. "I wonder, could you let me have your pot again? I have to make a curry for some friends tonight." "Yes, of course," said Mrs. Rizvi. "You may borrow it at any time. I'll get it right now." While Mrs. Sheikh waited, she hummed a little tune. Mrs. Rizvi went inside her house and took the pot out of a cupboard. She thought to herself, "I'm glad Parveen wants to borrow the pot again. Perhaps there will be another baby pot inside when she returns it." Mrs. Rizvi handed the pot to Mrs. Sheikh over the garden fence. "Thank you so much," said Mrs. Sheikh. "I'm sure everyone will enjoy the curry tonight. They did the last time, and it was all because of your pot." "I'm sure they will," said Mrs. Rizvi, smiling sweetly. Mrs. Sheikh went back into her kitchen. Mrs. Rizvi picked some jasmine flowers and then went back into her own house. Some days passed. Some weeks passed. In fact, more than a month passed. Mrs. Rizvi thought, "Where is my pot? Parveen has kept it a long time." But this time, Mrs. Sheikh did not return the pot. Mrs. Rizvi began to get quite cross. Then one day, she saw Mrs. Sheikh in the garden. "Aha!" thought Mrs. Rizvi. "Now is my chance. I shall ask Parveen for my pot." Mrs. Rizvi raced out into her own garden very quickly. "Hello, Parveen," said Mrs. Rizvi. "How are you today? I haven't seen you for a long, long time." "Hello, Rihanna," said Mrs. Sheikh. "Yes, you are quite right. We've not seen each other for ages. I think we last met when you borrowed my pot," said Mrs. Rizvi cleverly. "Oh dear, your pot!" exclaimed Mrs. Sheikh. "I'm so sorry. I have not returned it yet. Let me get it now." Mrs. Sheikh hurried into her house. Mrs. Rizvi stood in her garden and waited. She waited and waited, but Mrs. Sheikh did not appear. "Perhaps she's trying to find another baby pot to give me," thought Mrs. Rizvi. "I wish she'd hurry up." A few minutes later, Mrs. Sheikh came out of her house. She walked over to the fence and stood beside it. "I'm afraid I have some bad news for you, Rihanna," said Mrs. Sheikh sorrowfully. "Bad news?" said Mrs. Rizvi. "What bad news?" "Well, my dear," said Mrs. Sheikh, "I went to get your pot just now, but sadly it has died. I cannot give you back a dead pot. My pot has died, said Mrs. Risby. She was so surprised that she said it again, this time much louder. My pot has died? What are you saying? Yes, yes, said Mrs. Sheikh. It has died. It is no more. What are you saying? Shouted Mrs. Risby. Now she was quite angry. A pot does not live. A pot cannot die. Return it to me at once. One moment, cried Mrs. Sheikh. One moment, please. This is the same pot that gave birth to a baby. The baby is with you now. If a pot can have a baby, then it can also die. Mrs. Rizvi stood in her garden and stared at Mrs. Sheikh. Her mouth was open. She could not think of anything to say. And Mrs. Sheikh smiled sweetly and went indoors. We do not know if Mrs. Rizvi ever saw her pot again. So, children, how did you like the story? Isn't it fun? Reading is fun. Practice reading at home with the correct pronunciation and tone. Practice daily and place your finger below the word while reading out loud. Also try to learn the spellings from the word list given at the back of the book. Take care.